Imagine a room full of deadly traps and finding yourself right in the middle, all while a madman kept a close eye on you. No, I'm not talking about the premise of the Saw movies. I'm talking about a real-life horror story. Today on Superstitious, we cover the real-life serial killer H. Holmes and his infamous murder castle. John Kramer is one of the most notorious killers in horror films. Known as the Jigsaw Killer, or simply Jigsaw, he designed numerous traps that brutally murdered his victims. The purpose? To rehabilitate them, if they could escape. In his twisted mind, Jigsaw believed he was helping them, changing the world one person at a time. Never mind that his traps were almost impossible to escape, or that those who did survive were left with incurable scars, both physical and psychological. But at least he gave them a fighting chance, right? Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of his real-life counterpart. H. Holmes had no intention of ever letting his victims escape. Before we take a look at Holmes' murder history, I wanted to mention one quick trivia fact about the Saw franchise. There is one supporting character in the story that is directly based on a real-life criminal from the 1990s. Stick around to the end of the video to find out who. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged for the murder of his longtime accomplice Benjamin Pitezel. However, his murder count was much higher. Some reports claim that Holmes had killed as many as 200 people. But how can someone be so evil? He sounds more like a movie villain, doesn't he? Well, just like a movie villain, Holmes has an origin story. Born Herman Webster Mudgett, Holmes was bullied as a child. In his autobiography, he described one particular incident that may have had a lasting impact. As a child, he had a fear of the doctor's office, so his bullies decided to grab him and drag him inside, forcing him to stare at the remains of a human skeleton. He described the events as follows. I had been brought face to face with one of its grinning skeletons, which, with arms outstretched, seemed ready in its turn to seize me. It was a wicked and dangerous thing to do to a child of tender years and health, but it proved an heroic method of treatment, destined ultimately to cure me of my fears and to inculcate in me, first, a strong feeling of curiosity, and later, a desire to learn. However, Eric Larson, author of The Devil in the White City, has a different take. He believes the event probably did happen, albeit differently. According to him, it was more likely that the two older boys discovered that their 5-year-old victim did not mind the excursion, that far from struggling and shrieking, he merely gazed at the skeleton with cool appreciation. When his eyes settled back upon his captors, it was they who fled. Whether this event is to blame for setting Holmes on a dark path, or if the darkness was already there, we don't know. What we do know is that his curiosity about the human body went beyond what anyone could imagine, and his dark imaginations came to a high point during the Chicago's World's Fair. In 1893, Chicago became the home of the World's Fair, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to the New World. It became one of the most notable fairs in history, which was quite a feat, since the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 had destroyed much of the city only 22 years prior. The Chicago World's Fair featured various attractions, artists, and inventors. Architects used white staff to temporarily cover the buildings, giving the fairgrounds its nickname, the White City. Over 27 million people attended the fair, including some who would become the future victims of H. Holmes. You see, The fair was located only 3 miles away from the World's Fair Hotel, the building we know today as the Murder Castle. In 1886, Herman Mudgett arrived in Chicago and changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes. He was a wanted man, known for scamming people, which is why he changed his name. Before Chicago, he was a student at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. It was there that H. H. Holmes learned 2 main things: how the human anatomy works, and how to make money from selling corpses. When he arrived in Chicago, he got a job at a drugstore and would eventually buy an empty lot right across from it, the place that would become the Murder Castle. To build it, he hired multiple people, often firing them before the job was done and replacing them with new workers. He said their handiwork was poor quality, but in reality, he simply wanted free labor. There was also a darker reason. By switching his workers so often, none of them would know what exactly they were working on, or what the final product would look like. None of them knew they were building a death trap. The Murder Castle was a 3-story building that took up the entire block of 63rd and Wallace Street. Its official name was the World's Fair Hotel. By associating its name with the fair, Holmes would be able to draw many victims to his castle who were simply looking for a place to stay. In 1937, the Chicago Tribune described Holmes's castle as follows: "In all America, there was no other house like it. Its chimneys stuck out where chimneys should never stick out. Its stairways ended nowhere in particular. Winding passages brought the uninitiated with a frightful jerk back to where they had started from. There were rooms that had no doors. There were doors that had no rooms. A mysterious house it was indeed. A crooked house. A reflex of the builder's own distorted mind. In that house occurred dark and eerie deeds." Completed in 1892, Holmes's castle had 3 levels and a basement. The first floor was full of storefronts, while the 3rd floor had bedrooms for its residents. However, it was the 2nd floor and basement that contained the true horrors. On the 2nd floor, there were asphyxiation chambers that were airtight and soundproof. There were also rooms with no doors, and the only way to enter was through a trapdoor in the corner of the ceiling that opened from the outside. Some rooms were lined with iron, and at least one of them had evidence of fire. This iron room also had gas pipes, and the iron-lined walls made it soundproof. In other words, Holmes could burn people alive, and no one would hear them scream. If you somehow made it out of one of these trap rooms into the hallway, you would find yourself in a maze. There were doors that led to nowhere, and narrow hallways with awkward angles, all meant to disorient you while Holmes kept an eye on you. He had designed his own alarm system that would let him know whenever someone escaped one of his rooms. He could also turn on the gas and other traps from the comfort of his own room through a set of switches. If he wanted to take you by surprise, all Holmes had to do was walk through a secret set of hallways, spy on you through peepholes, and jump out from secret entrances planted throughout the 2nd floor. Finally, if you were unlucky enough to fall through the 2nd floor chutes, you would end up in the basement. Among the terrifying objects, there were acid tanks, operating tables, human-sized kilns, and quicklime for dissolving human flesh. One of these objects was a torture rack used to stretch a person until they could stretch no more. In a surgical lab, he would dissect his victims and strip them right to the bone, selling their skeletons to medical departments for money. In 1895, while Holmes was in jail awaiting trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, a large part of his murder castle was set on fire. Whether it was done by angry citizens or by one of Holmes's accomplices hoping to get rid of incriminating evidence, we don't know. What we do know is that currently there is a post office in the area where the castle once stood. It only covers part of the area because, remember, the castle took up an entire block. But there is an area in the basement that overlaps more closely with the basement of the castle. While the basement is off limits to the public, the History Channel was able to send a team of investigators down there in 2012. In the basement, there is a stepladder that leads to a hole in the wall, and a tunnel that could have served as an escape hatch from the castle. If you follow the tunnel, it eventually leads to a part that goes right into the castle's footprint. Adam Selzer, author of H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, was part of that investigative team. While down there, he discovered something unexpected. It turns out the castle's basement might be haunted. In one of his videos, Selzer begins whispering the names of Holmes's victims, when all of a sudden, you can hear the voice of a little girl singing in the background.
That while I was down in the tunnel, I started making some audio recordings, and for lack of a better idea, I started whispering the names of the few victims who were killed there, including Pearl Connor, an 8-year-old girl who disappeared. Some people say that they can hear her singing in this recording. Give it a listen.
If you believe in hauntings, it wouldn't be strange to believe that Holmes's murder castle was full of ghosts. But what if there were no victims? What if the whole thing was a lie? H. Holmes is kind of a celebrity among serial killers, but what if the whole thing was blown out of proportion? Some historians believe the story of the White City Devil was pure exaggeration, a result of yellow journalism or tabloids. It's true Holmes was a killer, but perhaps not to the extent that we think of today. Before his death, Holmes claimed that he had murdered 27 people. The problem is that some of his alleged victims were still alive. Even the fates of the castle may have been overblown. For example, one of his torture rooms was dubbed the Hanging Secret Chamber, a room created solely for the purpose of strangulation. However, some evidence suggests that this was simply the investigators' imagination. It turns out they had simply found a rope in a room and assumed it was used for strangling people. As Selzer wrote in his blog, Mysterious Chicago Tours, these were the same investigators who found a large tank filled with gas and emitting a noxious odor and decided to light a match to get a better look. But whether or not he was as big as his legend says, we know Holmes was a killer. We know he was probably responsible for at least 9 deaths: Benjamin Peitzel and his children, Alice, Nellie and Howard, Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, Emmeline Segrand, and sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams. They were each murdered for different reasons. I'm sure Holmes believed he was simply being practical as he got rid of people who knew too much. But for someone to kill not just 1, but 4 children, they would have to be monsters. And while the tales of his murder castle may have been exaggerated to a point, we know there is at least some truth to it. While investigators searched Holmes's castle, they found bones in the basement. But these weren't ordinary bones. They were children's bones, likely belonging to Pearl Connor. As promised, here is an interesting piece of trivia regarding the Saw universe. When creating the original story, James Wan read an article in the newspaper that inspired him to create one of the movie's supporting characters. Can you guess which one? It's Sepp. In the first movie, Zepp was an orderly who was blackmailed into abducting people for Jigsaw. James Wan came up with the idea after reading an article about a serial tickler. You heard that right. Allegedly, the man broke into people's houses to tickle their feet. After he was caught, he told investigators he was being forced to do it by someone else. He didn't know who was blackmailing him, just that he received the instructions in the mail. Oh, and one more thing. The instructions came with a Jigsaw puzzle piece.